In this module, we're going to discuss cyberterrorism. So what is cyberterrorism? So as with many things in the world of cyber, researchers are still attempting to find a universal definition. The general agreed definition is that cyberterrorism is considered any kind of attack that results in severe violence, economic damage. It's the most extreme version of a cyber attack. So there is direct intent to cause severe harm, to cause damage that can be possibly unable to be fixed. So there are violent intentions. You're looking to take something down. You're looking to be catastrophic in terms of the effect of your actions. And so cyber terrorists can be a group or an individual. So looking at severe destruction, and sometimes this can be politically motivated. And so you may hear a lot about cyber terrorism in terms of looking at nation states, different countries. What does it mean when we talk about cyber terrorism, and how does that deal from terrorism itself? So these are all the things that researchers are trying to come up with to define, to be able to really be able to classify and define cyber terrorism, because it's something that we talk about, but sometimes struggle to point to a specific example of when cyber terrorism has actually occurred versus is there a threat of cyber terrorism? And a lot of times you'll hear the media and researchers talk about the threat of cyber terrorism. So during this module, we'll be discussing what does that mean? What does that threat come to when we're talking about cyber terrorism? So many times when we're talking about cyber terrorism, what we do actually mean though is the role that the internet plays in terrorist attacks. So that's usually where the internet plays a role in terms of terrorism. So not traditionally classified as an attack, these terrorists can use the internet to do research, get knowledge, materials, and because of this, they leave digital footprints. So if there is a terrorist attack, one of the things that will happen is then the government or researchers may look at how is the internet used? Are there videos that were put out? Are there, can they track where they were located based on things that they may have published or posts that they have made? Are they able to follow the digital footprints? So how is the internet used either to get material, recruit others, and to organize information? So much like we all use the internet as a resource, terrorists can use the internet as a research facility for their crimes. And the other piece is the cyber attack itself. It may not cause direct violence or harm, but it can play a major role in it. And so one of the different kinds of attacks that you may hear people talking about is, well, what would happen if somebody were to attack our grids, our electrical grids, our power grids? Now, if somebody was to do a direct attack on our power grids, and we might classify that as cyber terrorism, but it gets sort of sticky because that's not actually causing the direct harm. Something like September 11th, well, that was clearly a definition of terrorism by direct impact of people getting hurt, of people getting killed, and it caused a huge amount of violence and harm, economic turmoil. I mean, it just turned us upside down. But now, let's say, if paired with that act of terrorism, so let's say on September 11th, there was also a cyber attack that took down hospitals or electrical power grids or energy during those September 11th attacks. Now there would have been more deaths and injuries. What if when the towers went down, you couldn't radio to people, you couldn't get them to a hospital, you couldn't get the electricals to work in a hospital? So in that role, it wouldn't just be a cyber terrorist attack by taking down the power grid, it would be a cyber terrorist attack coupled with something else. So in that response, again, it's using the internet and having it play a major role in terrorist attacks. Also, in terrorist organizations, they may use the internet to recruit members and spread their message. And they're also using the internet for quick release of videos and propaganda, threats. There can be an attack, and then the internet is used to either claim ownership for it, to send a message. So many times we find that the internet does play a role in terrorist attacks. The internet itself may not be the actual thing that causes the terrorist attack, but what role does it play? And as we become more technologically evolved, will it play a bigger role in terrorist attacks? So when we think about what cyber terrorism is, a lot of times it's not just a single definition of that was an act of cyber terrorism. We talk about the threat of cyber terrorism, and we're looking at the role that cyber and the internet and being online played in some of these more directive terrorist attacks. Where did they get information? Did they order materials? Did they order bombing materials? If you, for example, let's look at some of the ways that Al-Qaeda communicated. Were videos shared online? What were their recruiting tactics? So that's one of the questions that we're looking at. When we look at the events that happened on January 6th, the internet played a huge role in that. And so then what happened was government officials and hackers and people in the security industry were going through and looking at how these people use the internet to organize their activities. And through tracking them via the internet and looking at social media, they were able to catch a lot of those people. So the internet plays a role many times in sharing information and organizing these groups that want to perform illegal or what we might consider terrorist activities. So when we talk about cyber terrorism, hacktivism also comes up. And we talked about that hacktivists, sometimes they can fall into what we look at as this gray area. They're more intent on causing disruption, and they do believe that they're acting in a greater good. Now, again, the lines blur because one can say that cyber terrorists are doing something either for religious beliefs or beliefs that they feel are acting in the greater good. So it's easy to understand how these lines become blurred. So when we look at the way that things are broken down, we're looking at the motivations, all right? So nation states, a lot of times this can be geopolitical. They're looking to take down another country. They're looking to take the power out of a different country, or there's some competitive actions that are going on and that they're looking to essentially play a political move by taking down another country in some way or another. Okay, this can be seen as an act of war. This can get very fuzzy because when we're hacking, you know that we can't always tell the location. A good hacker knows how to respond anonymously, knows how to look as if they're coming from different areas. So when we look at, say, the Sony threat, there are beliefs that came from Korea, but we don't necessarily know. Do we know for sure where a cyber attack can come from? Not always, unless there's a particular group that claims it, or we're able to track through the internet those digital footprints. As we talked about in the hackers module, cyber criminals, a lot of times are looking either for profit, either they found an exploit that they're selling, or they're trying to make some sort of profit or gain from their criminal activities. With hacktivists, it's more ideological, so that they have a belief where they're trying to expose something that they feel is morally incorrect. So, for example, in looking at a hack like the Ashley Madison hack, they felt that there were people that were being hypocritical, claiming that sex was wrong, but then meanwhile they're on a sex site looking for partners. Or there was some hacktivists that took down and also attempted to take down some Republican groups, again under the theory of trying to argue against the January 6th activities, or trying to call people out for doing things that they didn't have the same philosophy as. So the difference with terrorist groups is they're actually looking for violence. So that's the violence and the intent to harm, direct intent to harm, is where the line is often drawn. So yes, with the hacktivists, they had a different ideological perspective with Ashley Madison. As a result, people did commit suicide. So there was harm, there was violence, but that was not the goal of the hacktivist. With the terrorist group who say take down a hospital's electrical grid during September 11th, they know people are going to die. That's their intent. Their intent is to make it so people can't help those who are injured. So their ideological views, they're going about them in a very violent way that they know and desire harm in others. You've got and as we talked about before, we've got the thrill seekers that are looking for the satisfaction, an insider threat, maybe an internal employee. And that's a lot of times their motivation is due to discontent. So anything when looking at any kind of cyber threat, we're looking at the motivation. And so with hacktivism versus terrorism, really the line is the violent intents. What is the intent of the particular, either an individual or a terrorist group? When you had Timothy McVeigh performing his act of terror, he knew that he was going to be killing people. He knew that people were going to die as a result of his actions. A hacktivist is more just ideological. They might, as we talked about, deface a website. They may call somebody out for something, but traditionally one is not considered just a hacktivist if their intent is to cause violence and harm and mass either hysteria or terror. And so it's looking at the goals. And so we're looking also at the radicalization. Now, when being exposed to radical ideology, and this is one that's very extreme in groups in terms of belief, feelings, or behaviors, and it's so in support of intergroup conflicts and violence. So again, looking at something in a belief that's so extreme that they're willing to be violent towards others. They're willing to hurt others. And so this is a gradual process. So let's say you have somebody, maybe a youth or somebody else, or just an adult, anybody. And so they may join a group. They may look at a group because they're interested. And it begins with information and exposure. And one of the things with the internet is it exposes us to so much. We have so much information that's right at our fingerprints, right at our fingertips. So whereas before the internet, it might be very hard to get access to information being shared from a different nation state or even a different town or state. But with the internet, there's so much access to it. And if you look at, we've done any look with group dynamics and groupthink, and it doesn't just start out right away. Okay, it starts out with bits and pieces of luring people in. So these terrorist groups, they may connect to people based on perceptions of injustice, a need for belonging, a personal identity, and so like-mindedness. So somebody may be looking for a group or for people that share their opinions. And so that's where it starts. And then they build on it, and become more and more desensitized to the different ideas. And then before you know it, you've come so far from maybe what you were originally looking for. And so you want to be looking at the radicalization process too. This is, if you look into research that's done on cult mentality, this is how it starts. When you do research on cults, it doesn't start with drinking the Kool-Aid, or Charles Manson didn't start by asking his group of people to kill people. It became a process of listening to the things that he had to say, of convincing them and getting them to think the way that he did, that appealing to people that may share a commonality in your thoughts. And so then ultimately regarding that radicalization. So we want to be looking at the process. So in looking at the motivation, the psychology of cyber terrorists, there's very little research on cyber terrorists, in part because they're hard to find. It's very difficult to find cyber terrorists who are willing to sit down and have a discussion about their activities. The motives are so different. They can be based on culture. They can be based on religion. They can be based on goals. If you look at, say, something like Timothy McVeigh, what his goals were, be very different from Al-Qaeda, be very different from Charles Manson, right? What are these motivations for these crime and these harm for other people? We want to believe also that there are personality abnormalities and psychiatric disorders. We want to believe that. It makes sense to be able to say, oh, that makes no sense. There must have been something wrong with them to think that. There must be some sort of abnormality, some sort of disorder. But humans do have a long history of vulnerability to brainwashing and persuasive tactics. Through that gradual process, before some people even realize it. And the internet is this huge resources for accessing those individuals for communication. And the way when you have somebody that is trying to lure somebody into something to convince them, it is this gradual process. And when we talk about a very hard topic on child pedophilia, how that process is, how they're groomed, how it doesn't begin right off the bat with this heavy hitter. It's a slow process of bit by bit steps They take one step, and then the next step doesn't seem so bad. And then the next step, and before you know it, as I said, you've come so far. And we ask that question of, why do people choose terrorism? So is it a choice or is it a resource? Do people actually make the choice, the conscious choice, and say, I'm going to do this act of terror? Or is it a resource? Do they view it as a resource for conveying how they feel, for expressing, if this will make the world listen to me, this is how I will get my point across? Is terrorism considered a point of communication, a radicalized one, an extreme one, a violent one, but still a form of communication and being heard? So is it a choice? Is it something that one chooses to do when they use it as a resource for communication? So all of these things, when something happens and there is either an act of terror, and we're looking at the role that the internet plays, because nowadays it plays such a key role in how people communicate. And sometimes that digital footprint can lead to better understanding the motivation and the psychology of these people. But then also to learn that the transition into radicalization is a process. It is something that takes time, and that takes from beginning to connect with people and speaking to people that may share something, and then taking them to the next step, and then the next step. And that we do have this history of brainwashing and persuasive tactics. We hear something, and somebody who can articulate and make something make sense and connect to what you already might believe or think or feel, then it's just pulling you along and taking you to that next step further. And they know how to do it. They're masters at it in many times, in many ways. And so I took this text this quote from your textbook, because I thought it was so good. Of the internet is a public space of the 21st century. Its global reach, chaotic structure, ease of access, anonymity, and our increasing dependence on it for the information, education, entertainment, and communication it offers makes it appear to be both a perfect tool for terrorists and a site of terror activity worldwide. And that right now really summarizes where we are with understanding cyberterrorism, and the difference between actual terror, what we traditionally know as terrorism, and cyberterrorism. Because we talk about threats to it, what could be done, but they're still struggling for a definition to say, what is cyberterrorism, an act of cyberterrorism? And has there been one? Is there one that we can point to and say, yes, they took down the electrical grid and it wasn't just a threat, it was actually designed to cause mass harm? And is it something that wasn't done in conjunction with another act of terrorism? So if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in the next module. Thank you.